Good morning. You know, this is the first time I've had to wear a tie since the first week in June. That's been awesome. I actually gave most of my ties away to my son-in-law. He's getting started needing to have them, so I wish him luck with that. Almost 2 weeks ago, my tooth started hurting. Now, that's not really unusual for me. My teeth are not the strongest. I've had 11 root canals so far. And in fact, in May, when I had my regular checkup, I had some pain. So I said something to the dentist, and he said, well, I don't see anything here. With the kind of dental work that you've had, sometimes things are going to get irritated, and then you're going to end up with some pain all along that nerve. So just settle it down, just be careful, and it'll go away. And he was right, it did. So this time I followed the same plan when this pain came along. And by Tuesday evening, I decided that maybe I needed to call the dentist on Wednesday morning. And then it was time to go to bed. And I went to bed, and I turned over on my left side because I'm a left side sleeper. And that's the side that tooth was on, and all the blood went to that area where it was swelling already, and it was excruciating. I think I got 2 hours sleep the whole night, and that was probably a gift. So as soon as the dentist's office was open on Wednesday, I was calling. Finally, I got through, and they could see me at 11 o'clock. So at 10:15, because it's all the way up in Granger, I took off. All this time, I'm thinking, I hope I don't get in an accident, because the only thing I could focus on was that tooth. I mean, it was the only thing that I could think about, I couldn't focus on anything else. So when the dentist looked at my x-ray, he said, so which tooth do you think it is? And I told him, and he said, yep, that's the one. I can see the infection down at the root. He said, you're going to have a root canal, or it's going to have to come out. And then he explained that the tooth itself had already a root canal, and so he was afraid it might be cracked, and if it was cracked, it was going to have to come out. So he said, you need to see a specialist. So I left with a prescription for an antibiotic and an appointment to see the endodontist on the next Monday. So this is Wednesday. I was going to have to wait till Monday. After about 24, 36 hours, it got bearable again because the antibiotic brought that swelling down. And that adding some extra strength Tylenol to that kind of got me through. So I got to the endodontist on Monday morning. It was Monday afternoon. I had to go cut grass at the lake before then. So I got there in the afternoon, and the guy looked at it and he said, well, actually, you've had 2 root canals in this tooth. He said, and he showed me on the x-ray, he said, they aren't able to get all the way down this canal. There's something blocking it. And so obviously there's an infection there, and it just keeps draining out problems. He said, we're going to have to do some surgery. Well, I wasn't prepared for that. I was prepared to have a tooth come out or to have a root canal, but not surgery. But we had surgery. And when it was over, I was given an ice pack, 3 prescriptions, and a set of directions to follow. Now, I had had this pain for over a week now, and I was a little concerned about what was going to happen when the anesthetic wore off from the surgery that I had. So I made sure, absolutely sure, I understood those directions. And I followed them to a T because I wanted this pain to stop, and I wanted it all to be over. Well, the book of Hebrews is one of the more unique books of the New Testament. It was more like a sermon than it was a letter. And it was written to a group of people who were feeling a great deal of pain and suffering. And they were the people who knew about Jewish faith and tradition. You see, the time that the book was written was a time period when the Romans were really creating lots of problems for the Jewish people. And it was right before the destruction of the Second Temple and the point at which it was actually against the law to be a Jew in the Roman Empire. Now, remember, at this time, those who followed Jesus were still Jews. So that was an important thing. This letter to the Hebrews was really, really important to them. Because what happened is that the writer says, look, Jesus is the proclaimer of God's word. Jesus is the high priest before God, the one who goes before each of us and presents us having given a sacrifice. The writer is using the terms that people would have known from that time period. And then he says, you will be relieved of your pain if you follow those words. If you do what God tells you to do through Jesus, you will be relieved of that pain. Here are some of the things that he says, and I'll include those 2 verses that we missed. Here's some of those things that he says, just some of the words. Let mutual love continue. Show hospitality to strangers. Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them, and those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. And that was not hard for them to imagine. Let marriage be held in honor by all. Keep your lives free of the love of money. Be content with what you have. Remember your leaders and imitate their faith. And then the part we didn't get, I'll read the whole verse. Through him, then, let us continually offer a sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of lips that confess his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. In the midst of the pain and the suffering the people were feeling at the hands of the Romans, the writer goes back to the heart of Jesus' message. These are the same ideas expressed in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. They are the same ideas represented in the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. They are the same ideas Jesus speaks over and over and over again throughout the Gospels. The message is so simple. It is the message that we are to love one another and give freely and joyfully, regardless of the cost. We are to identify with people we may not like and people who do things we may not like. Jesus calls us to give up some of ourselves for others. And remember, the writer of Hebrews has established that Jesus speaks for God. So these are some pretty important directions to follow. But then life intervenes. The comforts, the habits, the diversions we have created for ourselves come back and interfere with what we know we should do. And then we say that we don't want to do them. We may even convince ourselves that there's a good reason for us not to do some of these things, not to get involved, not to give freely. Our understanding of economics, fear for our safety, our prejudices, our arrogance, they all get in the way. And they keep us from following those simple directions. But then once we've talked about that and we've convinced ourselves, then good old James comes along, and James is always a difficult one for us to listen to. Be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror. For they look at themselves and on going away, immediately forget what they were like. But those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers act, they will be blessed in their doing. Oh man, I have to actually follow these directions? And not just some of them. I can't keep hearing the word, nodding my head, talking about it, and occasionally doing something. I have to be a doer. It has to be part of my identity. It has to be who I am. It has to be what people see in me. I have to actually make a significant sacrifice, not just what's left over, not what's easy to give. I have to sacrifice. Can't just talk it, can't just share. I've got to put it into action. The thing is, we know following God's call and truly giving of ourselves for the purposes Jesus calls us to brings joy, even when it's uncomfortable. We know that. We know that when we are experiencing hardships caused by being faithful to God's call in our lives, it is only through answering that call that we find that real happiness. The writer of Hebrews says that we can end our own pain and suffering in listening to and following the directions Jesus gives us, and we know it. Evil is personified in the Bible as Satan. And however you picture Satan, Jesus refers to him as the tempter. Satan tempts Jesus by offering to satisfy his hunger. He tempts Jesus by offering to give him a view of his power. He tempts Jesus to test God's love for him. Later, Jesus calls Peter Satan when Peter says to him, "You don't have to go through all that stuff." And Jesus says, "No, you are tempting. You are the tempter." And that's what we have to face all the time. We have temptation to not act everywhere around us. What does that mean for me personally? Well, we've been praying for Mary Down, of the girls who was kidnapped in Chibok in Nigeria. In addition to this great tragedy, thousands of people have been killed by Boko Haram in Nigeria, and the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria has been at the center of trying to help, trying to resolve the issues, trying to give a peaceful resistance, and it's been almost destroyed in the process. Annual Conference has had a chance to look at what's happening in Nigeria, and they've shared that through many, many ways. In our own district, the Northern Indiana District, for the last 2 years, has been focused on what we can do to help the Nigerian church. Creekside has been at the center of that. Creekside has been doing fundraiser, activity, work towards this end almost monthly. Last year they had an auction, and I was called to help. Well, the auction happened to be on a weekend that I was kind of holding open to go camping. So I said no. And I went camping. Now, Justice would say that I had a miserable time camping, but that's not true. I had a great time camping. The problem is exactly that, though. We lull ourselves into this feeling like we deserve the things that we get. We deserve to do these other things. And the fact is that when we give, it may be that we give up something over here, but what we gain is so much more. When I came back and talked to people who had been involved with that auction, the weather was terrible. They had storms. But they raised a huge amount of money and support, and the people who worked that auction had a wonderful time. They had a wonderful time. How could they not, with God blessing that activity? On the other side, I have a temptation that occurs about every year, about 2 weeks before camp comes along. It starts to look like, I'm not sure I want to go for this week at camp. Now, I've done this 40 times, and every time it seems like this temptation comes along. This year, I had to give up a play at Wagon Wheel, which I heard later was the best one they had all season. I had to give up babysitting time with Wendy. I had to give up some days at the lake. It was just right after my employment ended at South Bend, and I was just, right starting things and still didn't get a break. All that stuff goes through my head for those couple of weeks ahead of time. It would be so much easier to not do this. We only have a few kids that come to that camp. It wouldn't really be a horrible thing if we didn't get it done. But God does something in that time. Every time that I go and I'm complaining about the lack of air conditioning, and I'm complaining about the bed that I'm sleeping in, and the food that I have to eat, something happens. I leave that place far more energized. It's a booster to my faith. It is a way of healing for me. It takes that hole that's in my soul and fills it. And I need that. And God knows I need it. And Jesus tells us that we need it. What would the world look like if each of us started giving sacrificially? Giving up something when we're called to give that up. Going back to the scripture. Let mutual love continue. Would we make the church the center of our community again? Would our children's ministries grow and continue to flourish and work to help our entire community? Would we have more fellowship activities and be more of that community center? Show hospitality to strangers. Would we open our church to the neediest in our community and really meet their needs? Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them, and those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. Who are the imprisoned and the tortured in this community? Would we open our ministries to them? Would we consider opening our community to Syrian refugees, Sudanese refugees, Libyan refugees, Iraqi refugees? keep your lives free from the love of money, be content with what you have, would we stop clamoring after more things and be more open in our giving? Would we let the Spirit work in the church to find and to meet the needs of our community, of our larger group community, denominational needs, global needs? Remember your leaders and imitate their faith. Would we return to learning about and recognizing the leaders of our denomination? People who have set the model for sacrificial giving? Would we follow the example that they set? Who do you see here that you can imitate? Let us continually offer a sacrifice of praise to God. Will we truly put God in the center of our decision making? Would we allow God to define who God is instead of using the God we have defined for ourselves? What would this world be like if we actually did what Jesus directs us to do? It might be like the song Rex sung today. It might be like that. Listen to this. The road is long with many a winding turn that leads us to who knows where, who knows when. But I'm strong. Strong enough to carry him. He ain't heavy. He's my brother. So on we go. His welfare is my concern. No burden is he to bear. We'll get there. For I know he would not encumber me. He ain't heavy. He's my brother. If I'm laden at all, I'm laden with sadness that everyone's heart isn't filled with the gladness of love for one another. It's a long, long road from which there is no return. While we're on the way to there, why not share? And the load doesn't weigh me down at all. He ain't heavy. He's my brother. We know what the Word is. We know what the Word made flesh has called us to do. As James clearly tells us, just do what it says. Amen.